And I'm so happy to be talking to my friend and truly a mentor whose steps I followed as director of this wonderful institution that is the Weidenbaum Center. For those in the audience who might not be familiar with the Weidenbaum Center, we are a research institution that supports social scientific research here at Washington University. Each year, we provide hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund faculty research as well as administrative support for their grant work. We host lots of events, including like our event today. And all of that is in an effort to serve as a bridge between scholars, policymakers, and the public. I want to thank the staff of the Weidenbaum Center, including Elizabeth Larson and Alana Baim, as well as the Center for Digital Education here at Olin Business School, especially Sean Bell and George Delgado. They are responsible for this wonderful setup that you see today. We could not have organized this event without their help. Today's format is going to be a little bit different from our normal programs. Usually we would bring Steve in to discuss what's happening in the national and international economy. And I have no doubt that we'll have some conversations about public policy. But today we're going to have a little more informal personal conversation about Steve's long and distinguished career here at Washington University, where we'll address some of his academic and administrative roles, as well as his many varied research interests. We're also going to take questions from the audience. So we know we have people from all over the world, graduate students, former graduate students of Steve's, undergraduates, friends, family. So please drop any questions or embarrassing stories that you might have in the chat. I also want to emphasize that this is not some sort of retirement festschrift. In fact, I've already offered Steve to join us again once he has 50 years under his belt. So this is just a friendly conversation. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce Steve, although most of us probably know him pretty well. Steve is as I said, is the Bert A and Jeanette L. Lynch Distinguished Professor of Economics. He's also Professor of Sociology. He is an economist in his 42nd year on the Washington University faculty. He's currently he has a lot of titles, but my favorite of his titles is that he's a research fellow of the Weidenbaum Center. He served as associate director of the center from 2008 to 2020 and director from 2020 to 2022. He's taught microeconomic courses for thousands of undergraduates and advised a distinguished group of PhD students. And as I mentioned, many of those folks are in attendance today. A highlight of Steve's many university leadership roles was his term as the inaugural chair of the revived Department of Sociology. Not many people are crazy enough to be department chair. I've never met anybody crazy enough to be department chair of two departments. So I hope we can talk about that a little bit. Steve recruited the first 10 faculty members for the new department and worked with his new colleagues to create both undergraduate and graduate programs. He's his widely published research on business investment, sources of economic growth, and the macroeconomic effects of rising inequality has received over 20,000 citations. On a personal note, Steve is a friend and a mentor, and one of my greatest assets is having you down the hall and being the beneficiary of lots of your really amazing advice. So thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. That's a very gracious introduction, I must say. And I've enjoyed getting to know you more in these last years as you've come into the Weidenbaum Center. But just one small correction, especially for the students on there. I've taught macroeconomics
I'm sorry. Oh, my
to
goodness.
thousands of students. Actually, I did teach microeconomics early on, which is an interesting story in itself. But maybe I should let you run the story. But thanks, and thanks to everybody that's looking at the video. It's a really great honor and privilege to be connecting with old friends, new friends, and people around the world. It's very, very nice.
Well, thank you for being here. And, let's get started with, how did you become an economist? And maybe you could talk about what you did before you became an economist.
Well, that's a good question. How did I become an economist? I know my wife Jasmine's listening, and so she's probably thinking about this a little bit, or chuckling a little bit, because I think she would say I changed my undergraduate major 6 times, which isn't literally true, but it's kind of practically true. I was, I was a good high school student, and those days in the middle 1970s, early to mid 1970s, I graduated from high school in 1974, and people with my skill set were doing math and science, and I thought I would be a physicist.
Hmm.
I went to Cornell as in my first year, my freshman year, and was taking physics classes and things like that, and able to get more into transferring to Stanford and other kinds of things along those lines. And I liked it. I did okay. But I think even in my freshman year, I realized it wasn't quite for me, that I wasn't going to be this guy sitting in the labs watching balls collide, or oscilloscopes or other things like that. And I started to think maybe more about a business career of some kind. My father is a manager in foundries. It's a pretty big influence on my choice of direction in some ways. And I so I thought, well, if maybe if I'm going to do more of a business career or something like that, I should take an economics course. And so I did that. By this point, I had transferred to Stanford. I was still taking a little bit of physics. The intermediate electrodynamics course was tough,
Hmm.
which may have something to do with the fact that I was moving on. Uh, and interestingly, I took a course in the spring quarter of my sophomore year called Challengers to Capitalism, Marx, Lenin, and Mao, a
Hmm.
pretty interesting group. And this is not so long after the Vietnam protests and things like this that were going on. And I really did find it captivating.
Hmm.
And I got interested in what we call these days heterodox economics. And so I was, thinking about maybe I should go this direction. Then I took another course, and it was, it was a little bit mathy and didn't seem, terribly real world relevant. And I said, well, maybe I'm not going to do this. And then I started to think about maybe computer science. And interestingly, I was at Stanford University
Hmm.
in, let's say, 1975, 1976, Silicon Valley, computer science, these kinds of things. Uh, it occurred to me some years ago, I was actually sitting in the cafeteria here at WashU. It occurred to me that if I had stuck with that, I could have been rich. But I, I interviewed for jobs. I won't go into too much more detail about the whole computer science thing. It was, it was interesting and fun. I was getting coding and programming of the day and this type of thing. But I was starting interviewing with jobs, and at least at that time, it wasn't kind of super entrepreneurial Silicon Valley stuff that was going on. It was, I remember interviewing for a job on the space shuttle program, where
Hmm.
I'd be one of 500 programmers in Houston. And then I was interviewing for another job with kind of a nice fellow. He was talking about, we do work for the military, and where is it? It's in Colorado Springs. It's a nice place. We, go out with the military people on the weekends, and we have a nice time. And I love mountains, so that sounded pretty attractive to me. But he said it's confidential, so I can't really tell you the specifics of the work. And I was thinking after that interview, well, it's Colorado Springs. That's where NORAD is, in the Cheyenne Mountain. They are interviewing me to program the nuclear arsenal of the United States.
Hmm.
And I, come on, I'm not going to do this. Somebody was interested in heterodox economics. And so kind of at the very last minute, I think it was December of my senior year, I took the GRE right before the applications were due, and applied to a few grad programs, decided to stay at Stanford, where maybe this heterodox economics was strong. It was one of the few places around the country. It was a great place. Well, I guess then the rest is history in some sense. There have been a lot of evolutions there, but it was clear at that point, by the time I decided to go this way, that I was looking for an academic career in economics.
So I want to come back to your educational trajectory at Cornell and Stanford, but I just wanted you to say another word or two about your dad and his career, and how you sort of referred to that as maybe piquing your interest in economics at an early age. Could you just say a little more about
Yeah,
that?
well, yeah. I mean, so he worked in the foundry, very upper Midwest, the different foundries. Racine, Wisconsin was where I spent most of my younger years. Although,
Could you
I
just say,
mean,
what is a foundry?
a foundry. Oh, yes, a foundry is where you make parts out of metal. Well, actually, probably even other things, but he was mostly in gray iron, and so you make a mold, and you melt hot metal and pour the metal into the mold, and out comes an engine block, a manifold, a water pump housing, a
Hmm.
bearing cap. I mean, there it was very diverse in terms of what's going on, and so it was a the business, and I actually worked a little bit in the foundry when I was in college, and it made me think about, well, what kind of drives production and employment decisions. And so we may get more into this later, but one thing was, hey, when they sell more castings, they hire more people. And
Mm,
so I took that as kind of motivation for thinking about some of the ways I went. And it also probably helped motivate this notion that why was I interested in economics? Because I wanted to talk about what actually goes on in the world. I
mm,
didn't get into it because, oh, the models are cool and I like the math, but it was more like, I want to explain what goes on in the
mm,
foundry.
mm. Very interesting. We're gonna come back to that. But I was wondering if you could talk about, as I got to know you, I learned that you started off at Cornell, though of course you graduated with both your BS and your PhD from Stanford. So how did you get from Cornell to Stanford? What was that decision?
Well, the answer is very clear there. I transferred for love.
Ah, wonderful,
And,
wonderful.
Jasmine and I, who I transferred to be with, just celebrated our 46th wedding anniversary, 2 children,
Congratulations.
2 grandchildren. And so it's a pretty straightforward reason. It was, a little bit contentious in some ways because they're both very fine schools. And I think maybe my family was a little bit understood the East Coast more than the West Coast a little better, but it all worked out. And one thing I think that was particularly relevant for my academic career about the transfer is that Cornell was great. I actually had a good first year there. I had very close friends. I enjoyed it. I got to know the culture of the eastern part of the United States better as a result. Lots of folks from Long Island, and I like that a lot. But I think Stanford was a little bit more open in general.
Hmm.
And in the Challenges to Capitalism course that put me on this track, that would not have existed elsewhere. So it's this kind of, random factor. In fact, my friend, co-author, co-teacher, Mark Rank has just written a book on the random factor and just the randomness that leads to these paths. If I hadn't transferred, I don't know where I'd be, but I almost surely would not be an economist.
Could you say a little bit more about your intellectual development at Stanford? Maybe who did you work with? What was your dissertation? I imagine it was an influential choice in your life, and I'm guessing maybe the decision to stay at Stanford was also because of love. But perhaps
Well,
you'd like to.
actually, we were married. We got married right after we got our both on the same class. We married right after graduation, and probably other things equal, the families would have wanted us to go back to Wisconsin, where I actually applied. But staying at Stanford really was sensible for me because of my interest in kind of non-mainstream economics, and there
Mm,
weren't many programs that were doing that. I the person who taught the Challengers to Capitalism course was a very engaging professor named John Gurley. We knew him as Jack, and he had been president of the American Economics Association, who's quite well-known monetary economist, mainstream, but had become somewhat radicalized during the Vietnam War, and so had moved in this direction to talk about challengers to capitalism. And my primary mentor, my mentor really in graduate school is Donald Harris, who we actually just recently seen. We had a nice gathering of former graduate students with Don last fall in Washington, D.C. He's a wonderful man, a great intellectual. His background actually comes from Jamaica
mm,
in many ways, and he was wonderful in this in a variety of ways. He's a great teacher, very deep, deep thinker. But he also really gave me my own head.
mm,
It was kind of like, go for it, do
mm,
these things.
mm,
And in the short run, that was actually a bit risky because I didn't come to Washington University particularly well prepared to publish in some sense, because Don kind of let me do what I was going to do. And I wrote this 260-page dissertation. But in the long run, I think it helped, kind of allow me to think outside the box some. And I really appreciate, his support over many years. Wonderful man.
so let's keep talking about your research. And you expressed to me, and have said it elsewhere, that two simple ideas led to 4.5 decades of research. I was wondering if you could tell us what those simple ideas are, and maybe unpack those statements a little bit for
Okay,
us.
that's an interesting way of looking at it, but it's actually quite true.
Hmm.
So actually, I'll start with the first simple idea, which actually did motivate a lot of my dissertation, and I'm still working with it today, which is that if businesses sell more, they produce more, and they hire more workers. Big surprise! No big surprise. Uh, the the second idea was if businesses have more money, they'll spend more on investment, build more capital. I mean, really, those are the motivations. Very real world oriented. Very much a sense of this is what's actually going on out there, independent of fancy models and things like this. And so they've just motivated the work over the years. And in some ways, I honestly, it's not like I thought of this ahead of time and I knew this, but looking back on it, that's really where the kind of core of the ideas came from.
Interesting. So you mentioned heterodox economics. Could you just say a little bit more about what that means? And maybe on this same vein, I think I've heard you describe yourself, and I've certainly heard others describe you as a Keynesian.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yes. Well, one shouldn't overdo the heterodox label. I mean, part of this is trying to understand what's actually going on. But I have marched a bit to my own drummer on this. And this idea that firms produce more when they sell more, well, where does that go? Goes to the idea that what's going to drive production, what's going to drive employment, what's going to drive growth, what's going to drive business cycles is going to be sales, which is, in the economics jargon, demand, demand side economics. And that's what's often associated with Keynes. And in many ways, I didn't realize so much when I was starting my research and my PhD work, my dissertation work, that I was going to be such a Keynesian. But I wanted to understand what was going on. And the foundry experience comes back. Why did the foundry, sometimes do really well? Because there are lots of people who are buying their castings. Why did they hit the skids in a recession? Because the sales fell. It's a very pro-cyclical industry. And so building my initial dissertation model, the model that was the core of my dissertation, with that intuition led me to say, oh, look at this, I'm a Keynesian. In fact, I probably discovered that mostly my first semester teaching at WashU when I was teaching graduate macro and said, kind of figuring things out, the night before class, and said, this is Keynes.
We're going to talk about teaching, and I want to come back to this idea of how you've grown as a scholar through teaching. But first, I want to ask you about, you mentioned several times the importance of the real world and real world events. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and specifically, how have real world events influenced your thinking as an economist over your career? I'm thinking about things like the pandemic, the Great Recession, which you've written on. So how would you answer that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I suppose maybe the earlier part of my career, certainly the beginning of my years here at WashU, I was working more in a little bit more theoretical plane in many respects. I started to do some empirical work, which we'll get into, but these were the things I was thinking about early on. But I was always interested in saying, I want my models, I want my theory to correspond to what I actually see happening out there. And more or less, the experience largely confirmed that. I would say that for the first, probably about the first half of my career, it's a pretty long time, 20-ish years, the demand side perspective seemed kind of right, and there were various things that were consistent with that. But the Great Recession really was a validation in some ways of this idea, to see this massive collapse in the demand from the consumer sector, related to problems in the housing market, consumer debt, things like this. And hope we can talk about a little bit more of that work, much of which was done with a Washington University undergraduate, wonderful guy, Barry Cinnamon, who I'm still working with. But we met it when he was an undergrad here at WashU. And, it really did validate that perspective. And in some ways gave me a little more confidence. Maybe the heterodox part of it might be more like this. The idea that demand drives recessions, not everybody agrees with that, but it's pretty mainstream. Where this moved a little further away from, a little more outside the box for me, was this idea, well, maybe the pattern of demand over time, the way that sales evolve over longer periods of time, will matter for economic growth, where that's less common in mainstream economics. So, and that's something that I'm working on right now. Again, a lot of people I'd like to bring into this process, but I have a graduate student right now, Alejandro Gonzalez, who's brilliant, and we've just been working hard on a great big paper that's studying these longer term implications of demand.
Interesting. Has the pandemic, I mean, what an unusual experience in terms of a shock to supply and demand. Has that factored into your thinking as an economist at all? Or are you still processing it, or what?
It's been a real challenge. So I guess broadly, now that I think about it, I could say that what I was observing up until the pandemic more or less fit my demand model, my demand growth model, and how demand spills over to supply and these kinds of things. The pandemic just threw a wrench into that. I mean, it was so unusual. Clearly, there were effects on both sides. That there was an initial shutdown, people stopped spending, so you could have had the demand problem. You had a massive fiscal stimulus related to the demand side, but you also had these big constraints on supply. We've all heard this term supply chains, and the emergence of inflation. When I first started in the early 1980s, inflation was high, but basically over my entire professional career, it's been falling and then stable.
Mm.
And so then you have this big uptick in inflation and trying to deal with this. And so in we'll talk more about my specific courses, but my current macro issues course, I certainly had to address this. When I was teaching it the fall after I guess fall of 2020, after the kind of early stages of the pandemic, students and I were struggling to some extent. How do we fit this all together? I would say, though, that after a few years of thinking this through, the kind of connections between supply, demand, pricing, and how that all plays out, and also economic policy, has really informed the way that I think about macro and broadened my perspectives.
Very interesting. Do you have a piece of research or two that is your favorite, or the pieces that you think best represent your thinking, or that you're happiest about?
Yes, I mean there are the two questions, and we've talked most about the businesses produce more when they sell more question. So let me go to the second one, which idea of businesses investing more when they have more money, when they're if I want to be a little bit more technical about it, the idea that businesses actually face financial constraints on their investment, that they access to finance matters in a sense. And again, maybe only an economist would think that isn't true. It's like that all the time businesses are looking for money, and it can be challenging. But there was a and I'm digressing a little bit, but I hope that's okay from the papers. I'll get there. When I kind of got into this in the 1970s, there was a view that was emerging. It became pretty mainstream that what really drives business investment is what economists would call the fundamentals. The idea, well, it's how productive is it? What's the rate of return? And if we've got a good project, we should be able to get the money. And so the idea of kind of shoving finance to the background. And there were some dissenters from that view, one of whom was quite important in my career, Hyman Minsky, who was a professor here from the 1960s until around 1990, a mentor for me, relevant to my hiring at Washington University in many respects. And Minsky emphasized the central role of finance for investment decisions, all the way through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but he was a bit outside of the mainstream. And actually, I got into working on this topic at Stanford because of another graduate student, Tracy Mott, who was working with the same advisor and studying these issues and actually trying to maybe find empirical evidence for Minsky's ideas. But Tracy was a wonderful guy, but he didn't know how to run the computer. Remember, I had that computer science background, so I helped him work out the data for his computer or for his dissertation, which then led into a series of papers on this idea that actually finance does matter for investment. Firms are financially constrained, and this really took off in the time I arrived here. That a lot of the economic theories were changing. There were ideas about actually maybe there are financial constraints, and there was issues about information. I won't go into the technical details, but people became very interested in this. And I was very fortunate for a serendipitous path that we could talk about, but we'll be here for hours if I keep on that, to connect with Bruce Peterson. And Bruce and I wrote a number of papers. Our most well-known one is also with Glenn Hubbard, who is now at Columbia University, has had a very distinguished career and has generated a huge amount of citations. We were at the right place at the right time, and it's also a very good paper, in my humble opinion. Although I would, you evolve over time, and while that paper published in 1988 in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity is the most well-known, the paper that Bruce and I wrote with a WashU graduate student, Jamie Brown, who's also now had a very nice career in a business school at Iowa, I believe, is with the paper I was kind of leading to in this long story, which is that sense of just we were looking at that point more at research and development and how it links to finance, and just the empirical work is, I'm very proud of it, and I owe Bruce a lot. Bruce is he just was he's a great researcher, a fine economist. He was, while I tend to be a bit eclectic, Bruce is very focused on these financial constraint issues, and I learned so much from him, and so that worked out really well. On the more Keynesian side, demand leading the economy. The recent work has been very rewarding. I, in some ways, it's related to my teaching because I had a lot of different ideas along these lines. But at some point, I would get to this part of my class, and I'd say, well, you know what? Where we are is that demand's pretty important to determining production, and so you got to figure out what the path of demand is going forward. And it seems like over longer periods of time, you can't just have demand. We also need to expand the resources. The standards of living have to work, and it's probably the case that strong demand spills over to more innovation and more employment and more labor supply. And I'd kind of, honestly, somewhat wave my hands about that story. But in a paper that we were working on for some years, but it was published in 2020, it's called Demand-Led Growth with Accommodating Supply. It's a little more, again, the title's a bit boring. But it basically says the demand side can pull the supply side along with it, which really is a bit opposite of mainstream macro thinking over the long term. And I did this paper with my Italian friends. I should like to mention these people. So Piero Ferri, who we work with, we have a number of papers. Started with my other Washington University colleague, Ed Greenberg, both of whom we've lost fairly recently, which is sad, but I really owe them a lot. And I have this connection to Bergamo in Italy where Piero worked, which is, kind of an important part of my life. Jasmine and I are off to Bergamo in about 12 days, even though we've lost Piero, but we still have connections with other friends and economists there. I'll be giving some lectures, and so it's very sweet. But the demand-led growth with accommodating supply really starts to change the perspective, because it says if we focus on the demand side, we can actually, that's going to be important for the economy, not just in the short run, but in the long run. That a strong demand today will help stimulate more supply, stimulate more innovation, and pull the economy along with it. And if you kind of miss that, and I think mainstream policy often does miss it, you could have growth lower. You could settle a growth level that's lower than you could. And how you figure that out is a challenge. And this is where my work with Alejandro comes in, which is a very deep empirical study, which I owe to him because his econometrics is really strong. And I was putting together the ideas from the 2020 paper with this empirical work, and it's really cemented together this research agenda. So I'm really quite excited about that.
Oh, that's great.
I have a good question.
We have a question from our Zoom chat.
Okay, so Steve, this is from David Switzer.
This is from David Switzer asks,
For those of us former students of yours who now teach principles of macro, what one or two heterodox examples or concepts would you recommend we incorporate? And especially to give a more realistic picture of the macro economy. So what one or two principles of one or two heterodox examples would you?
Andrew, I'll
Sure.
repeat that question.
Okay.
This is a little more techy than our plan was coming. So, hello, David. David's a PhD student from years ago. Glad to hear you. Glad that you're joining us. So, it's a great question. I think where I just went would be the.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Sorry. I was going to repeat the question. Okay. Yeah. So David asked what principles or what ideas from heterodox macro would I encourage people who are teaching, introductory economics to discuss, and I'd relate that to our conversation that we've just been having, which is that kind of the mainstream view, the textbook view is going to be, yes, demand side things, fluctuations in spending, monetary policy, these issues, even government stimulus matter for business cycles. They matter for the short term. Maybe we need some demand stimulus when we're in a recession to help us get out. But in the long run, it's all about supply. It's all about the resources and the productivity of the economy. And at least open the question about whether that is entirely correct. And could there be a more nuanced relationship? In the long run, demand and supply are both important. You have to have them both. But the feedback may not be just, at some point, the Fed will make sure that we get up to the supply determined path. It might be a stronger demand path would actually pull the supply side along with it. And that's a topic that I talk about a lot about in my courses.
Great. Let's, you've answered this in some regard, but, and maybe enough has already been said, but I was wondering if you could talk about how being an economist here at Washington University has influenced you. What is, in addition to the people you've already mentioned, how has this place influenced you as a scholar?
So a couple of thoughts there. One thing, I'm grateful to Washington University. We've talked a little bit about my background and the kind of research I was doing as a graduate student. So it was a bit of a risky bet, both because I hadn't, like I said, I wasn't all that prepared for publication and things like that. The topic was not what probably most people on the job market in those early '80s years were doing. But Larry Meyer, the chair when I who hired me, kind of liked what he saw, and Hyman Minsky, I know now, was lobbying strongly for my appointment back in the day, and they took a chance on me. And so, in one broad sense, they gave me the opportunity. Tenure was far from guaranteed, and actually, probably for most of those early years, I was pretty much, I wasn't so sure I would be at Washington University for 42 years. Publications came. The paper with Bruce and Glenn Hubbard was very helpful. Came at a good time, so all worked out. But I do really appreciate the willingness of the university to support somebody who was kind of marching to his own drummer in a little bit different way in that sense. And that was true really for much of my career. The year after I came here, Wilhelm Neuefeind, a good friend, became department chair. We did a lot of backpacking together. Where our families are very close, and Wilhelm was a great mentor and kind of said, give me the record to get you through, but we support what you're doing. And that was the message I was getting from Wilhelm, my other senior colleague I already mentioned, Ed Greenberg, and others in those years. And so that's I feel very grateful for that. I have to mention Hyman Minsky's presence here. And so I've talked a little bit about his interest in finance and business cycles and Keynesian macroeconomics broadly conceived. And he had a lot of influence on me. Hyman was a bit gruff in some respects, not always the person who would, give you detailed mentorship, but he was always very supportive. And his ideas are profound. And in fact, certainly my work with Barry Cinnamon on the Great Recession was motivated by Hyman and things like that. One thing I regret a little bit is that I understood Hyman better after he was gone. It was kind of a nuanced perspective and things like that, and it required a bit of maturity there, the way of linking the history with the theory to come up with a very interesting perspective on things. And I've given a number of lectures and written a number of papers on Hyman Minsky's economics over the years, and he's a WashU person. And just broadly support. It's been a good place to work, and working with the students, no doubt. But I'm sure we'll get there.
Yes, we will. We will. Before we get there, I wanted, we couldn't let the hour go by without talking a little bit about Murray Weidenbaum and the Weidenbaum Center. I was wondering if you could talk about your relationship with the Weidenbaum Center, how it started, the roles you've had, and also maybe any personal reflections on your relationship with Murray Weidenbaum, who is, of course, the namesake for our center, a famous economist in his own right, and the first chairman of President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about Murray with affection and respect. So Murray was always very supportive. If we were getting a little bit into the right and left politics of these kinds of things, I mean, the Keynesian macroeconomics is, tends to be a somewhat a left-wing perspective. My objective, I'd like to say, is understanding the world in which we live. But it turns out that my understanding is moving in the left-leaning way. Of course, Murray was on the other side. He was the Reagan administration and Nixon administration, and it was a prominent economist, both in public service and academically on the right. So I particularly appreciate his personal support for me, which wasn't about politics or things like that. You're doing good work. Good for you. In fact, one of the things I remember about Murray, fairly toward the end of his life, Hyman had already passed away quite some time ago, but I was by that point the associate director of the Weidenbaum Center in my current office in the center. Murray had an office in the center, and I found a note on my desk around the Great Recession about these Minsky-like dynamics of finance causing this crisis, and Murray has a little note: Hyman would be proud. And so that kind of respect, it was very meaningful in that sense. Murray, supported me in my early days in the old Center for Study of American Business, which is what it was called when he founded the center. Provided various kinds of support for seminar speakers. I got to know more of the economics profession, people who undoubtedly wrote me tenure letters because Murray was helping to fund bringing them in at those times. He did, the center did actually also fund and organize for me one of my first international trips to a conference in Japan, which is too interesting a story for me not to take 30 seconds about this. So they were going to pay for a business class ticket, which, you know, I never flew business class back in the days of Japan. It was a lot of money. So, well, I could take Jasmine along. And that should be fine. She can stay in my room, right? It's no big deal. So she flew with me to Japan. We got there and found out that we had roommates at the conference.
Oh, no.
And so they were a little flustered about this, but Jasmine became one of the female members of the conference as a result of this, as it all played out. So we had an interesting experience that started with Murray. And then later in my career, as I moved through the ranks and took on administrative roles, Murray was a a great mentor for me in that sense. And as a result, I mean, you know, I was involved when Murray was moving to the later part of his career and stepping down as directing the Center for Study of American Business. I was at the time chair of economics department and was asked, along with Jack Knight, one of your former colleagues, to co-chair the search committee for a replacement for Murray. And we did a really good thing. At least we didn't. We found the right person. Actually, it came through another one of your colleagues, recently retired Randy Calvert, who identified for us the person who will be very familiar to the Weidenbaum Center people listening to this, Steve Smith, who came into from the University of Minnesota to direct the center. I guess it must be about 23, 24 years ago now, and Steve really transformed the Weidenbaum Center.
Yes.
To focus on the research support and public policy outreach that we have. And, you know, we were grateful for Murray for raising a lot of the funding that still helps us do all the things that we do in the center. But I really appreciate Steve's leadership in renaming the center in honor of Murray and making the center to what it is today, which is a really integral part of the social sciences at Washington University, helping me personally with my research, and also Steve as a mentor. He and a great scholar of American politics. I learned a lot of politics and working with Steve over the years, and learned a lot about administration and kind of running things. He provided some really critical advice as we brought the sociology department back, and so. There's this long association, and the current director, Andrew Reeves, has also become a good friend, and I really appreciate what's happening in the center these days. And so it's been a great association, and happy to be part of it.
Well, I'm grateful for many of the things you've done here, but bringing Steve Smith is towards the top of that list. So thank you. So I want to pivot into teaching, and sort of on that note. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on how the economics department has changed or remained the same over the past 40 some years that you've been here.
Well, the economics department has changed significantly. So there's kind of two economics departments. Regimes isn't quite the right word, but, you know, just ways of going. The department I joined and was chair of was, you know, good department, you know, fairly eclectic and in its approach. You know, the Hyman Minsky, the man of the left, down the hall from Murray Weidenbaum, the man of the right. You know, this kind of perspective. It was a very comfortable place, a very supportive place in many ways. Not to be critical, but maybe a little bit sleepy in some thoughts, as is often the case, right? You know, and I think the university, it actually was during my time as chair of econ, which would have been from 1999 up until 2005. Was saying we need to make more of an investment in the department, and so there was kind of a big bang change. Ping Wang from Vanderbilt was hired when I stepped down as chair to be the outside chair of economics, and engaged a big hiring plan that brought a lot of prominent senior people to Washington University and changed the department quite significantly over that time. I mean, to say it's a little bit of kibitzing. They moved away from the Keynesian direction in that context. And so as such, I was a little less intellectually tied into, especially the macroeconomics group and the current econ department, but very fine work and very fine scholars that went there. And the department has expanded a lot. My friend and colleague Gaetano Antonolfi just stepped down as chair. I actually proud of the fact that I helped mentor Gaetano from the time he was an assistant professor through tenure, and he became department chair, and I think he had a lot of success in bringing some new interesting faculty to economics. So it's moved quite a bit. And I must say, we'll talk about sociology, that my administrative focus of recent years has really been more the sociology department.
Okay, we have some questions from Zoom. Let's hear them.
And the second one will be about sociology. The first one is, how did your sabbatical at St. Louis Fed shape your research?
So we have a question about how your sabbatical at the St. Louis Fed affected your outlook.
This is so much fun because I get to tell all my stories. So this is 1986, 87, I believe. So I'm getting towards the end of my assistant professor time. Things are still a little tenuous about making it through the rigorous tenure review process. And one of the things that happened during those years was that you could stop the tenure clock by taking a year leave. So it's not quite a sabbatical, it's a year leave. And so Larry Meyer, who I've mentioned before, wanted to help me. And so he had connections with the Fed. So he helped arrange for me to have a visiting position at the St. Louis Fed for a year. And interestingly, I had a trade with Rick Hafer, who's still here, a prominent economist here. He's no longer at the Fed, but he's teaching in the area. And so Rick came to teach at WashU. I took Rick's office down at the Fed, and I spent a year down there. And it was an important year for me. I did write a few papers for the Fed on, at the time there was the Tax Reform Act, and kind of how the Tax Reform Act would be affecting business investment, which was one of my research topics. And they were successful, and the people down there liked them, had good relationships with folks down there. It also was where the main empirical work was done for the 1988 Brookings paper with Bruce Peterson and Glenn Hubbard that became this kind of flagship paper. And so there's those years before the internet, we were sending, hard copy empirical results by Federal Express, regularly. And, the Fed's good about that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
They have support, they create money. So fine, all the FedEx you want, So we were doing a lot of FedExing and things along those lines. And I had a nice relationship with the folks down there. Dan Thornton, who's still in the area, I remember, and is a good person, Rick, and things like that. And I also got a chance to get a little bit more of an inside perspective on monetary policy because I would attend the briefings for the Fed president before he would go to the FOMC meetings, which is the interest rate setting committee, and could talk about these things, and see how people made their arguments and stuff like that. Sometimes maybe it's interesting to see how the sausage is actually made.
That's fascinating. And we have another question
It's
from.
not sociology, so it's about how sociology influences your economics thinking. But if you want,
Yeah, so this is a question about sociology, and this is something I really want to hear you talk about. Talk about your role in bringing this department back to Washington University.
And what an unusual path to follow that nobody could have ever predicted. So in the various administrative roles I was taking on, I was, for one thing, and what's the history? What's the basic history? So Washington University had really a distinguished sociology department, but a contentious sociology department in the 1960s and into the early 1970s. For reasons, one reason led to another. I'm not quite sure what was happening. By the time I got in the early 80s, the view was sociology department has hit kind of hard times. And one possibility would be they would have invested in the department and tried to build it up. But they decided that was too expensive. At least that was the main perspective. And the decision was made around the time I was getting tenure, late 1980s, to shut down the Washington University sociology department. And the result was that there was a hole in the academic curriculum. There were various attempts to fill it. There was a program when many good people tried, to fill this with something called social thought and analysis. Professor John Bowen, another friend, just retired, was very instrumental in working that out. But probably by the early 2000s, it became pretty clear to the leadership. Ed Macias was dean at the time, that it would be good to bring back a sociology department. And there were various efforts to do that. There was some outside recruiting effort that took for years and then kind of didn't work out. And then there was the Great Recession, and there was a transition of deans, and one thing led to another. So now we're probably 2013, 2014 in that rough area. And I was on something called the Academic Planning Committee, which was kind of like the dean's internal cabinet, people to advisory to the dean that they would choose. And Barbara Shaw had become dean at this point, and Barbara and I had a history working together. And she asked me, I'd been on the APC, the Academic Planning Committee, before. She asked me to come back, which actually turned out to be during a sabbatical year, and I was a little hesitant, but Barbara said, I need you. Okay, just a few meetings a year. And the fall meeting, and I think it was this fall of 2013, but I might have the dates wrong. Barbara and distinguished professor of psychology and also a good friend, Roddy Rudiger, gave a presentation to the academic planning committee about the importance of bringing back sociology. The question was, how could we do it? And how could it be effective? And how could it somewhat fit into the culture of Washington University? And this idea of hiring a outside chair and bringing that in, well, that could work, but there's a lot of uncertainty with these senior hires, and somebody wouldn't really know the culture of the place. And so the idea came up that, well, could we actually do this with internal leadership? And in some sense, that was challenging because we didn't have sociologists. But the idea is, well, we know how to recruit faculty. We can get advice from the outside. We're a good university. There's a good foundation here. Let's see, could we pull this off? And I walked out of that meeting thinking, maybe I'd be interested in being part of that process. And I remember it was probably a day or two after that meeting, I went to see my friend Mark Rank, who is a sociologist in the Brown School, probably the only sociologist on the campus at the time, tenured sociologist anyway, on the campus. And I was talking to Mark about this. I'm thinking about this, but I must be crazy. How could this economist, helps to restart a sociology department? And Mark said, "You're not crazy at all. You'd be good at it. You should do it."
What piqued your interest?
I think it was clear that I had become more and more interested over these years. Another thread of this in inequality, economic inequality. I had been writing these papers with Barry Cinnamon that was arguing that rising economic inequality was part of the process that led to the Great Recession, led people to take on debt and things along these lines. And so, I've been talking to Mark too, who is a poverty scholar and written extensively about inequality and been, kind of inspired by that work. In fact, it was leading to our joint teaching, which we'll talk about. So it was, I think my personal interest was the importance of inequality in the sense that we were missing important dimensions of inequality. And I learned how much we were because, I was focused on the economic side, but, race and gender and sexuality and the kinds of things that sociologists, which was a much broader spectrum of things. And so it seemed to me a very worthwhile initiative for Washington University with lots of support from Barbara. Roddy Rudiger became effectively kind of a co-chair. We did co-chair the initial search committee, but this is how it all got started. And I remember Roddy calling me and saying, Barbara's decided to go ahead with this project, and she wants you and I to co-chair the search committee to bring the first cadre of faculty to Washington University in sociology. I said, okay, I'm willing to do that. So are we searching for a department chair? And Roddy said, no, she wants you to be the chair too. And this was all happening about a week to 10 days before Jasmine and I were off on a sabbatical trip. I was on sabbatical this year to Australia. And, we had this trip all planned out. And I had a brief meeting with Barbara. We kind of laid out a very rough sketch of what we would do, a commitment to initially hire 10 faculty members, eventually to build a graduate program. And said, okay, let's go. And then I had to learn something about sociology, which meant meeting with distinguished sociologists around the country. We set up an advisory committee, very good group of people who, were very helpful in terms of advice about, kind of a broad direction of the department, not so much specifics, but also were willing to vet job candidates. And the interesting thing is we had also a large search committee here of senior faculty members at Washington University to help get this process going. And as it turned out, with a lot of help from Mark for me to learn how to read sociology CVs, our judgment about hiring seemed to be fine. I would run these ideas by the committee and say, oh yeah, these are great people. And so our first group of people, I'll mention their names, David Cunningham, Jake Rosenfeld, and Adia Harvey Wingfield, was a huge success.
Yes.
And, people said, go, you did it. And, then we were off and running.
Well, I just think it's another example of something you've done that has really transformed the university. I mean, our sociology department is brought amazing faculty doing amazing things, and the benefits extend certainly to the Weidenbaum Center, but really campus wide.
It has been, I entirely agree. It has an incredibly rewarding part of my career. It was a heck of a lot of work, but it was challenging.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. In fact, somebody was saying, well, this is something that happens once in a generation. I said, no, it's like once in a century to restart the department at a major university and something like this. It was, we made some good decisions. We got some good luck. Again, the initial recruiting of that group and the next group of junior faculty two of the three are still with us and just got tenure, Ariella Schachter and Katie Collins. I can't help mentioning all these
Yeah.
names. Just outstanding scholars and become great friends. And I remain quite engaged with the sociology department and, love working with them.
Absolutely. And Ariella is our associate director.
Absolutely,
So
yes.
we're extremely grateful for that. So we only have about 8 minutes left, but I want to turn to teaching. And why don't you talk to us a little bit about the courses you've taught, the memories that stand out in your teaching career here at Washington University?
Yeah, it's my teaching has been, central to everything in some respects. Honestly, I was less than fully confident that my research would get me tenure at Washington University. I never had any concern that the teaching would be a barrier. I've always been confident and able to, relate with students, from the very beginning. We don't have that much time. I taught lots of big courses early on.
Mm-hmm.
Our current junior faculty, in some ways, don't know. I sound like the old man here. Don't know how good they have it. I had 3 preps my first year, and that was a course release.
Mm-hmm.
It was 4, 2 and 2, four courses beyond that.
Now, people outside of academia are listening, so we have to be careful about,
Right.
Yeah.
What's a prep? I prepared 3 brand new courses from the beginning, which is a huge amount of work in my first years here. And one was the core graduate course in macroeconomics. David Switzer, who asked a question there, was one of my students down the road there, and I taught that pretty much every year for about 20 years. And then I did it was actually the principles of microeconomics. It really was micro that I did in my first years, where I would have hundreds of students every semester, and the intermediate macroeconomics course, which was also a course of 40, 50 students, a core class in the undergraduate curriculum. It's a huge amount of work, but also super engaging. And I learned a lot of macroeconomics. I mean, teaching that graduate macro course, the first time was tough. I mean, I was, for some reason they put me on a Monday, Friday schedule. I would never do that to anybody in terms of teaching, but I'd finish the Friday class and I wasn't sure what was coming Monday. So the weekends were interesting in that sense. But, it's where a lot of my ideas about kind of Keynesian macro and how it has really congealed as I tried to connect what was happening into real world macroeconomics in that process. And so that was a great experience. Teaching the undergrad courses was terrific. I felt like I was learning with my students. When I was younger and teaching, in some ways I could really connect with them. I was actually younger than some of my students. I was 26 when I came here. I remember a student in my earlier years had been in Vietnam, and he was back. He was quite a few years older than me, and I was roughly the same age as my grad students, maybe a year or two older. So I was learning along with them at that time, and that was very engaging. And in some sense, I thought I was maybe in some ways more effective and more clear when I was actually learning along with them. As I matured, my perspectives expanded pretty dramatically, and I think I offer a much richer set of thoughts and ideas, much more developed, much wider and more extensive, both kind of the extensive margin economists say and the intensive margin deeper in some respects. But there are times when I think I can be moving a little faster than my students, and so I have to kind of watch myself in that sense. My current macroeconomics issues courses that I teach right now, my upper level undergraduate macro seminar, it's on my syllabus saying this is going to be fast moving. There are going to be lots of threads. There'll be some spontaneity. You should be ready in that respect. And so that class has been a staple for me for a long time. I did. After getting tenure, said, I've been teaching all these big classes in this core graduate class. I'd like to teach an upper level, seminar. And I started the current macro issues class probably in the early 1990s. And then when I was department chair and the curriculum changed and the art to science curriculum required an upper level writing intensive course. And I was chair and I felt like, well, how am I going to ask my colleagues to do this? Us economists don't think we can teach writing. And so only if I do it myself. And so I transformed that class into a writing intensive course. And interestingly, I still don't know if I can teach writing per se, but that course is better as a writing intensive course with people writing essays and doing it that way. The economics is better and they get more writing experience. And then maybe I know we're short on time, so let me just talk a little bit about the economic realities of the American dream.
I was going to say, it's informative how much teaching has actually come up in this conversation, but I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that course.
So this is, again, a quick story, which was, I had 2 serious thoughts about leaving Washington University. One was very early on when I was worried about getting tenure, and fortunately, people encouraged me to stay. Things were starting to break, and I got some good support. Wilhelm Neufeind, in particular, was helpful in that very tough decision. But then later on, in some ways, because of my somewhat more heterodox, out-of-the-box economics, could there be a job opportunity came up where I would have more colleagues, somewhat more linked to what I was my core interest, especially in Keynesian macro, and but for a variety of reasons, Jasmine and I didn't really want to leave St. Louis. We'd been here a long time. I was really well connected for the university. I really liked it here, and the dean at the time, Ed Macias, was a friend as well as a mentor, and Ed asked me, well, think about what you could do here to reproduce part of what you would leave to do.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things was teaching something related more to inequality. And, Mark Rank and I were friends, Mark in the Brown School. I had been to Mark's, as the story we tell at the beginning of every class, every American Dream class, when the semester begins, that I had gone to Mark's installation with his chaired professorship. And he'd given this great talk on what he was doing at the time, his book called One Nation Underprivileged, and about poverty and how it was relevant to American values and things like this. And I just said, this is a reason to come to work in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mark and I started talking about these issues and said, well, maybe we could teach together. And so this became Economic Realities of the American Dream. It's a great class. It's a lot of work for me. I mean, I can teach macro class with a few minutes prep. I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. Every American Dream class, I got to do the reading again. I got to think about this. I have to write but it's worth it. And it's very interdisciplinary. It's just, we're thinking much more broadly about American society and the way it interacts with inequality and economics. And we are now in the early to mid stages of writing a book together
That's great.
on this topic. Mark's faster than me, but I'm doing my part. And so hopefully this will really be an exciting culmination to that project.
Fantastic. Well, I'm disappointed we didn't talk about the accordion or the piano or whether a Keynesian ever opposes government spending, but maybe we can do that in another conversation.
Yeah, so you're 50, right? Although Jasmine's saying there, so he'll never make it to that long. But anyway, we'll see how it goes.
Maybe even before 50. Steve, I want to thank you so much for doing this today. At this point, I want to take a moment to invite all of our viewers to check out our website, wc.wusel.edu. That is linked in the chat, so you can click there. Please take a look at everything the Weidenbaum Center does. Consider donating. Consider becoming an Elliott Society member. If you give $1,000 a year, you receive all of the benefits of joining the Elliott Society, along as invitations to all of our Weidenbaum Center events, including our world-renowned policy lunches, which frequently feature Steve Fazzari. For those of you that are members, thank you so much. Thank you for attending this event and all of your support in all that we do. I also want to invite everyone to our favorite event of the year. That is our annual reception, which is on May 16th. Information for that event is also in the chat, so please register and join us for that celebration. Steve, thank you so much. I mean, we just learn. I mean, I know it, but to talk about the impact you've had on this university, these departments, and certainly me personally is just a real honor. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, very much, and everybody was listening. And I apologize for talking too fast, but that's just me.
All right. Thank you, everybody.